So welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to WSET School London's webinar this evening on Cabernet Franc. My name is Lydia Harrison, MW. I organise the event programme at the WSET School in London, as well as being an educator and tutor there for their courses from level 1 to diploma. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Richard Lane, a recent WSET School London diploma graduate, who has also done some tasting events and webinars for us previously. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard and he's going to take you through Cabernet Franc. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and good evening, everyone. It's really exciting to be talking to you again, and if you've been to any of my webinars before, thanks for that. Last time I think it was Bergerac, and the time before that was Languedoc. But yeah, tonight we're going to explore Cabernet Franc. I really wanted to do this webinar because I've always thought I loved Cabernet Franc, but didn't know it very well. So I thought it'd be a good idea to know more about it by having the pressure of doing a webinar, and then I'm going to have to find out loads about it. So come on this journey with me this evening, and hopefully we'll find some things out about it. By the way, I'm not holding a potato in that photograph. That's actually me in Bergerac holding a bit of limestone, I think, and we'll talk about limestone a bit this evening. But really, I suppose, just a few little starters, context, backdrop to this. What is Cabernet Franc? Where is it grown? I mean, we all know Cabernet Franc, don't we? Or do we? Because it's got great heritage. It's the parent of Cabernet Sauvignon. It's the parent of Merlot. It's the parent of Carmenère. Gosh, it's got some distinguished children, precocious children. But what about Cabernet Franc itself? It's certainly known as a useful blending variety, particularly in places like right bank Bordeaux. And it's known as a single variety, obviously, especially in places like the Loire Valley. But I just wonder if it's a bit more than this and what's going on internationally with Cabernet Franc. I mean, clearly we're going to talk about France a bit, but France isn't the whole picture. And, you know, just a personal note, I was trying to rack my brains to think when I first came under the spell, I suppose, of Cabernet Franc. And I think it was a bit of a spell. And like all these things, it was a bit fortuitous. It was about 15 years ago. And a good friend of mine lives in Paris, so I'm able to go there quite often, pre-COVID, obviously. And I remember tasting some Cabernet Franc, 100% Loire Valley, could well have been a Chinon in the Loire Valley. And I remember thinking, this is the most delicious red wine I've ever tasted in my life. Where's it been all my life? I then tasted loads more of it subsequently and was always disappointed. So I thought, did I just have a one-off hit? Did I have a one-night stand with Cabernet Franc? Or could it be a more fulfilling relationship? And then perhaps, you know, that's something to do with stuff we're going to talk about in a minute, like climate and climate change and things warming up. But the first time I tasted that Loire Cabernet Franc 15 years ago, I thought it was like a baby Cabernet Sauvignon because it was lighter bodied, fragrant, fruity. Ironic, isn't it, calling the parent the baby, but you know what I mean. So there we go. Next slide, please, Lydia. We'll start off really with just a little tiny quiz. No prizes, I'm afraid, but by all means, just guess where this is. You know, there's a fabulous chateau sitting on top of the hill there. By all means, pop your answer in the chat. If not, I'll in a few slides' time, I'll reveal all if you don't already know. But if someone gets it right in the chat, I expect you'll all know by then anyway. So yeah, just look at that lovely photograph of that ancient chateau, which I think is probably 12th century, sitting on top of that lovely river. And I just want to pose a few little thoughts about Cabernet Franc. I sort of did a bit of a lexicon type exercise. I wanted to just think of a few adjectives that sprung to mind when I think of Cabernet Franc. I came up with the following: elegant, refined, distinguished, subtle, noble, historic, unfashionable. And then moving more into sort of aromas and flavors, I was thinking fresh and delicate, hauntingly aromatic nose of raspberry leaf, roses and violets. And I think the aromatics of Cabernet Franc, or a certain style of Cabernet Franc, are very much about its aromatics. I've even written down, and I can't believe I've done it, pencil shavings, because in the 1990s, when I used to watch the food and drink program on the BBC here in the UK, there used to be a presenter called Gilly Goulding, and she was a double act with Oz Clarke. They're quite flamboyant, and Gilly Goulding was the ultimate taster, very flamboyant. She was always bouncing around the studio going, oh, beeswax, and ceiling fittings, and goodness knows what else she was coming up with. And then she said pencil shavings. I thought, she's really lost the plot. Pencil shavings, I have to say, when I'm smelling, particularly a ripe Loire Cabernet Franc, it smells of graphite. It smells of HB pencils that have just been sharpened. Goodness me. On the palate, Cabernet Franc certainly has a backbone because it has quite firm acidity, and that can obviously relate to the fact that particularly in the Loire, but we will move on from Loire, the acidity can be quite high. It's a coolish region, but certainly it can be elegant, it can be spicy. I think where Cabernet Franc differs particularly from its son, Cabernet Sauvignon, has really soft tannins. And I think the tannins and the way winemakers extract the tannins in Cabernet Franc is a kind of key really to what it can be a really magical taste experience with Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Sauvignon is a bit bolder. And occasionally you might get with Cabernet Franc notes of chocolate or even a bit of coffee. And occasionally, you can, well, certainly not occasionally, you can get a long finish, and some wines, particularly in the riper vintages, can have aging potential. Maybe not as long as, top Bordeaux wines that are Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot dominated, but yeah, the top Cabernet Franc could certainly age at least 10 years. But the other side of Cabernet Franc, it can also be overly acidic, excessively green and stalky, very little fruit evidence, lacking generosity, underwhelming, unwelcoming, disappointing. Oh dear. So I think really this perhaps is, maybe you've had this experience too, or these experiences too. I think Cabernet Franc is a bit of an enigma. It's a bit unpredictable. And so maybe we're going to explore a bit about how maybe the reputation or the styles of Cabernet Franc have evolved and maybe how they're changing, particularly in light of things like climate change. And maybe it's this unpredictability that could explain the fact that actually Cabernet Franc is pretty low profile, really, when you think about it. And that unfashionable thing, just a quick note, it was great to read in The Guardian here in the UK just 10 days ago or so, Fiona Beckett, wine writer, authoring an article which is entitled, "Is this the red wine you didn't know you were missing?" Okay, next slide, please. Lydia, quick history lesson. You know you always get a history lesson with me. Sorry, folks, but do listen. It'll be very quick. This guy, he was very powerful. He was called Cardinal Richelieu. He was at the height of his powers in the 1620s, 1630s in France. He basically, clearly he was a churchman. He was a cardinal. He pretty much ran France and made France the impressive nation state that it is. France still had a monarchy then, but some people thought, particularly Alexandre Dumas in the Musketeers books, that really Cardinal Richelieu ran France. Well, what Cardinal Richelieu did, which is relevant tonight, is that at this time, Cabernet Franc was probably hanging out further south than the Loire Valley. Could even have been in the Basque Country in northern Spain, San Sebastian, just over the border from Biarritz. Certainly it was in southwest France, areas today that we call places like Madiran, and certainly in the border area too. But what Cardinal Richelieu did, because the big court of France where he was doing all his business was in Anjou, he said, I want Cabernet Franc in the Loire Valley because we need to grow it here because this is where I'm working and I like the taste of it. So basically, Cabernet Franc moved to the Loire Valley, if you like, from its origins further south in the early 17th century. Next slide, please, Lydia. I really, really wanted to show you this picture by Pierre-Auguste Renoir from 1880. This is a luncheon of the boating party. sorry, a bit indulgent, I know, but I just realized that when I was about 15 or 16, I had a poster of this on my bedroom wall, thinking I was, you know, a sophisticated teenager trying to impress people, friends, girlfriends, all the rest of it, probably failing miserably. But actually, I do love this because 1880s, by the way, I don't think the River Loire is featured here. Definitely going to be more like the River Seine further north, but you get the point. Late 19th century, sort of Parisian type feel, luncheon, you can see the wine bottles. Were they bottles of Cabernet Franc? We don't know, of course, but they could have been. They absolutely could have been, because of course the Loire Valley with its river meant that the Paris market was certainly very accessible. And Renoir and his mates could well have been sipping Cabernet Franc, why not? And I also just wanted to mention this now because people increasingly always want to know about food pairings and stuff. And I'm not about to give chapter and verse on food pairings, but what I would say is Cabernet Franc is incredibly versatile with food because it's often, particularly in the Loire style, light, medium bodied, it can be fruity, bit of acidity, obviously. It's got that backbone of acidity, but sort of soft tannins, not too big on the tannins front. I think it can go really well with food. So it can be great with picnic food, actually. So for a lunch party, in a similar way to the way that Beaujolais can be great picnic food. Okay, it's not the same as Gamay, it's not the same as Beaujolais, but you can sort of see where it's coming from. Basically, I think when it comes to Cabernet Franc, just give it a go and pair it with what you like. So yeah, of course, we're in France. It's in France where 2/3 of Cabernet Franc is grown in the world, which is why we're going to focus on France for another few minutes. Okay, next slide, please, Lydia. A couple of maps, just fairly quickly. Hopefully, many of you will recognise this. Particularly, by the way, good luck if you're doing D3 diploma next week. Golly, all the best with that. Those are the big final exams for diploma. Here's the Loire Valley. And you know, in the middle of the picture, it's the middle Loire really that's relevant for Cabernet Franc. It's grown in those areas of Anjou-Saumur and in Touraine as well. Okay. Next slide, please, Lydia. Anjou-Saumur. Okay. So Cabernet Franc grows pretty well here because you know it's pretty. The summers are pretty warm. I mean, Cabernet Franc needs to ripen. Remember, it ripens. Students of you will remember anyway, but for others, it ripens a little earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon, about a week earlier, which is why it's suitable for growing here in the Loire Valley. Cabernet Sauvignon can struggle to ripen here in the Loire Valley, a bit too far north, around 47 degrees north. Anjou-Saumur, I mean, let's not forget, Cabernet Franc is versatile. Lots and lots of rosé wines that no one wants to drink except the people who live in the Loire. I happen to like them. They're so unfashionable. They're deep pink. They're sometimes sort of medium dry or medium sweet. You know, the Cabernet d'Anjou. Everyone's drinking, of course, Provence rosé, and you know that's up to them. And I don't mind a glass of that too. Would I like to be in Provence right now with a glass of rosé? Of course I would. But I think the Loire rosés are great, and the Cabernet. There are many Loire rosés. I won't go into all of them, but the Cabernet d'Anjou is the one that's dominated by Cabernet Franc, sometimes with a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon as well. And not forgetting sparkling wine as well. You can buy a sparkling Saumur Brut rosé. Had one the other day, absolutely lovely, made from Cabernet Franc. And of course, in Anjou-Saumur, we have to mention a really important, very trendy appellation, actually. Well, as trendy, I think, as the Loire Valley ever gets, and that is Saumur Champigny, red wines only, making some terrific wines. Domaine Filiatro would be an example of a great producer there. Next slide, please, Lydia. Touraine, so you can see the city of Tours in the middle of the map. Great city, Tours, and about 50 kilometers southwest of Tours, you can see Chinon. So just so you're aware where we are in France, we're 300 kilometers southwest of Paris here, okay, along the Loire Valley in the middle Loire. And in case any of you are still wondering where that mystery chateau was, it was the chateau, it is the chateau of Chinon, okay? That's where we were. Joan of Arc was a visitor there in the 1420s. And in a moment, we'll be going to Chinon, but just not quite yet. Just to mention a couple of things. Well, I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that, as we know, climates have been, particularly the past, certainly this millennium, I mean, the evidence is indisputable now for climate change over the past 20 years. But even if you look at the past 5 years, gosh, there's been some really warm summers. 15, 16, 17 got off to a bad start, but it was warm. 18, very warm. 19, they've all been warm the past 5 summers, certainly in the Loire, which is interesting. And so I think that's going to be kind of relevant when we think about perhaps, are we beginning to see not an end to, but a change away from that very cool climate Cabernet Franc Loire style, which was perhaps a bit thin, light-bodied, a bit acidic, lacking fruit, you know, the ungenerous one I was describing earlier. But to find out more, I'm delighted to say that we're going to go now to a vineyard in Chinon, because last Thursday, I spoke to a lovely chap called Jerome Dillard. By the way, here he comes. And Jerome is going to give us, here he is, 7 minutes. Let's listen.
20 hectares here in Manoblay, and in Chinon, it represents 2,400 hectares.
Wow, yeah, it's Cabernet Franc is a big deal in Chinon. What is Cabernet Franc like as a cépage, as a variety in the vineyard? Is it difficult to grow? Obviously it buds earlier and it ripens earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon, which is why obviously it's so successful in the Loire. What are the most critical decisions you have to make with Cabernet Franc? Is it the decision when to harvest?
Yes, of course. The maturity is a big key of a great Cabernet Franc. As you know, Cabernet always get a little bit of green flavors, of greenness or spiciness. And it's true that Cabernet Franc here in the Loire Valley, which is quite north in terms of vineyard, it's a really great importance to pick it at the right time. Otherwise, in the vineyard, Cabernet Franc is in terms of growing in the fields. It's a quite easy grape variety to grow. And here in Chinon, it's perhaps also easy because we know it since centuries.
Yes,
so to be honest, yes,
you know how to deal with
it's any other grape variety seems to me very difficult.
Oh, very good, Jerome. Final question in the vineyard before we go inside briefly to your cave. What about the seasons, the vintages in Chinon? Because clearly the summers generally are getting warmer recently. Because when I used to taste Cabernet Franc from the Loire Valley, to me, I would always have to be careful that it was a warm vintage. Otherwise, it could taste underripe. Not saying your wine, but generally speaking, Cabernet Franc, when it's underripe, is not always at its best. I get the feeling now that every year, just about the past 5 years, you can get beautifully ripe Cabernet Franc now. Is that right?
Yes. What's happened is Chinon and in the Loire Valley, there is really a small plot of Cabernet Franc at the confluence of, I guess you say confluence of,
yes.
between the river La Loire and La Vienne. In that small area, you have Saumur-Champigny, Chinon, Saint-Nicolas-de-Bourgueil, and Bourgueil, which is all those appellations are Cabernet Franc. And more east, Cabernet Franc is difficult to ripe. More west, it's too dry because of the slate.
The slate soils, yes. What is the best?
Yeah.
So I know you have many terroirs, but just briefly, Jerome, what is the best soil, the best terroir for you for Cabernet Franc?
So here, Tuffeau is really, really interesting right now with the new climate. I will say new climate because we have much more maturity, as you said. And here, what you can see here, I will try to show you. It's it's clay. I don't know if you can see the clay.
We've got some, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, we can see it. So you have argile, you have clay, and you have tuffeau, which is
clay
like
and tuffeau.
Yeah.
And tuffeau, which is really interesting. So sometimes you can get fossils, but not
Fossils, yeah.
Fossils.
Mm.
But it's and what is interesting in that kind of soil is really that the watering is moderate,
Yeah.
but always um, it happens you have some moisture during all the season, which is really interesting. As the Cabernet Franc, it's different from the Cabernet Sauvignon, but Cabernet Franc do not like too much hydric stress.
Okay. So the water retention in the little bit of argile, the clay,
Yes.
is really beneficial for Cabernet Franc because Cabernet Franc likes a little bit of water, does not want to be stressed.
Yes.
Perfect. Jerome,
yes, exactly.
That is fantastic.
And the tuffeau.
And yeah, the tuffeau.
The tuffeau, you can see the house just behind me. It's tuffeau, it's limestone soil. And here, tuffeau is also interesting as tuffeau is a little, it's porous, and it always gives some nice watering. I will try to show you here. You can see perhaps I'm just 1 meter below where just the previous soil, and here you can see here the tuffeau. You can so it's not a big it's not lots of clay. The tuffeau is just below.
Fantastic. Oh, Jerome,
can you hear me?
I can. No, that is so
Yes,
interesting. Yeah, we heard all that very well. Jerome, it is so interesting to hear this and for people to see your vineyard and your terroir. It's just incredible. So thank you. Jerome, I think rather than go inside, maybe we just take the final question here in the vineyard because it's so lovely where you are. Is that okay?
As you like. The cave is beautiful too.
Okay, let's go. Okay, let's go inside. Let's go inside.
Richard, I just need you to unmute. I just muted you while the video is playing. You just need to unmute yourself. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry about that. Great. Thank you, Lydia. And thanks everyone for bearing up there with a slightly grainy, pixelated video and not brilliant sound, but I thought it was really worth it. I mean, Jerome Dillard, sorry. And I hope some of you are tasting, along with me, his wine, because it's one of the two that I'm going to compare at the end. I'm going to compare his lovely Chinon wine called Le Temps des Cerises, The Weather of Cherries, which is 2019 from his domain de la Noblet, which is an organic vineyard that you saw there in Chinon. And Jerome is just a great guy. And also to mention, we did film, I use the word film, slightly, you know what I mean, delicately, inside his cave. And at the end, you'll be able to pick up the link so you can listen to Jerome talking about winemaking decisions for Cabernet Franc. It's really interesting. But because of time, of course, we do have to carry on. So good. Next slide, please, Lydia. Okay. Bordeaux, right. We are going to get out of France, I promise. Another couple of minutes and then we'll be to some other places in the world. And just a quick thing to say, it's impossible to go to some areas tonight because Cabernet Franc, although it's not planted widely in many countries, it is virtually everywhere in small proportions, but with apologies. And I know there are some great producers. Tonight, we are not going to be in Australia or New Zealand or South Africa or Spain or Portugal. So apologies for that. But in Bordeaux right bank, Cabernet Franc is significant. It's used in the blend there because, as I've already mentioned, it ripens a bit earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon, and that's an advantage on the right bank of Bordeaux, where the clay soils are cooler and where those clay soils can struggle to ripen Cabernet Sauvignon. Okay, so Cabernet Franc represents 18% of Bordeaux plantings. And just looking at the map here, Lydia, I think you're going to highlight, if you just highlight the area, two things I want you to look for, which will be explained in a sec. Little area between Saint-Emilion and Pomerol, because we're about to go to a very prestigious, see a photo from a very prestigious estate. So we'll be going there. And also to mention on the other side, Castillon, Côte de Castillon, sorry, Castillon Côte de Bordeaux. They changed the name fairly recently, over on the right. Is also going to be relevant. Okay, next slide, Lydia, please. This is a rather splendid gnarled old vine, 60-year-old vines of Cabernet Franc from none other than Chateau Cheval Blanc. Okay, a really, really super prestigious right bank Bordeaux estate. The kind of wines produced that not many of us can afford to drink, sadly, but I have to mention it briefly because what they do with Cabernet Franc is so interesting. These vines are 60 years of age. There are lots of 60-year-old vines around Bordeaux because the frost of 1956 was so terrible that there was lots of replanting going on. And sadly, I think that's going to be the case again this year, although Bordeaux, I think, has certainly right bank hasn't been so bad, or Cheval Blanc haven't been too badly affected. But interestingly, at Cheval Blanc, unlike the rest of Bordeaux, where you'll just find normally maybe 5–10% Cabernet Franc in the blend, with Merlot obviously dominating the blend on the right bank, here at Cheval Blanc, 49% is Cabernet Franc, 47% Merlot, and 3%, guess what? A little insignificant grape variety called Cabernet Sauvignon. Okay, they've got 40 hectares, 3 terroirs, and it's the terroir at Cheval Blanc, which really, I think, explains why they do what they do and why Cabernet Franc is used so much more widely here than anywhere else in Bordeaux. They've got fine textured clay, coarse textured gravel, and large gravel and sand. So it's like a hybrid really of Saint-Emilion gravel and Pomerol clay. So they can really do some remarkable things because if you've got a very heavy, cool clay soil, you can get some very powerful wines. But obviously, if the vines are grown on sandier soils, the drainage is much better, and therefore those vines take up less nutrients because of the water leaving the vines more quickly, and therefore you get a slightly lighter, more aromatic style. So at a place like Cheval Blanc, where every one of their 237,000 vines is tagged and profiled for terroir, I am not kidding, could explain why their wines were so expensive. You can do some extraordinary things. And most people, particularly diploma students, probably will want to know, where does this fit into the Saint-Emilion classification system? Well, you won't be surprised to hear it's in the top layer, which means it is Premier Grand Cru Classé A of the Saint-Emilion classification, that is Chateau Cheval Blanc. Okay, just also to mention, at a slightly more affordable level, sort of £10 or a bit over compared with £100 and a bit over, at Castillon, Côte de Castillon, Chateau de Pitré, they are making a wine there 100%, not always, but they occasionally do 100% Cabernet Franc there. Wine Society occasionally do one. Okay, and before we leave France, just a passing shot on southwest France, in Madiran, where they have that really tough Tannat grape variety. Cabernet Franc is used there to kind of try and smooth out some of the toughness of the tannins of Tannet. Try and say that after a glass of Tannat. So, there you go. Next slide, please, Lydia. Italy is the country that 14% is the next biggest sort of planter of Cabernet Franc, but I'm not going to talk about it much, mainly because quite possibly a lot of Cabernet Franc in Italy, may well be Carmenere. There's a bit of confusion going on, but just to mention Tuscany, because the Super Tuscan movement started in the late 60s, early 70s, and that was basically Bordeaux varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc and Merlot being planted in the coastal areas of southern Tuscany. In the early 80s, Bulgari DOC was created as an appellation, and in Bulgari DOC, the rules say you can use up to 100% of those Bordeaux varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, or Merlot. Okay, very different to what most people think Tuscany is about, which of course would be Chianti and Chianti Classico. Although a little bit of those Bordeaux varieties, up to 15%, 15%, is allowed in Chianti DOCG. Okay. Next slide, please. Well, let's go to Hungary. This is a bit different. We don't hear much about Hungary, and it's not on the WSET syllabus except Tokai, which covers the sweet wines of the Tokai in the WSET syllabus. Hungary is a really interesting country. I don't know much about it. I've had a lot of help with the next two slides. So big shout out to Sue Tolson, who lives in Budapest and is an MW student. Also to Julia Scarvo, who's written a lot about Hungary, and also a diploma colleague of mine, Peter Larsen in Denmark, who's a big Cabernet Franc / Hungary fan. Just want Lydia to highlight, it is planted in various regions. There's only time to highlight one. It looks like villainy, which is an amusing word in English. But I've been practicing, Sue, if you're listening tonight, Sue Tolson, it's pronounced Villagne, okay, Villagne. And this is in the south of the country, as you can see, and lots of major Cabernet Franc developments there in recent years. And let's just look at the next slide, please, Lydia. Look at this rather lovely slide of these vines and the sun peeping through and the slopes. Basically, it's pretty warm climate actually in southern Hungary. The summer temperatures can be seriously hot down there. They're facing south, these slopes. They're facing towards places like Croatia. I mean, so you've almost got an Adriatic influence, getting towards a Mediterranean influence, even though it's a continental climate in Hungary, obviously. And it means you can get some really good ripening of Cabernet Franc grapes here. The late Michael Broadbent 20 years ago said he wondered whether Cabernet Franc had found its true home in Villagne. That's a big statement. And since 2014, Villagne have been on a branding exercise, and they have a premium classification of Cabernet Franc, and it's not called Cabernet Franc, it's called Villagne Franc, okay? So they can't quite get Cabernet Franc on the label, but they get Villagne Franc on the label. You have to say that's a bit more than most of the wines in the Loire Valley who don't put the grape variety on the label. There are about 330 hectares of Cabernet Franc in Villagne, which is not the whole picture. There are 2,500 hectares of Villagne with other grapes, lots of indigenous Hungarian grapes. Okay. But it's interesting, but although it's worth noting that 80% of this kind of premiumization of Villagne Franc is being consumed within Hungary, I think it sounds like they need a bit of an international marketing effort really for people to know about these wines. Right, next slide, please. Lydia, we are whizzing across the Atlantic to Argentina. Wow, I haven't been to Argentina and they're struggling terribly with COVID at the moment, poor things, but golly, do they produce some lovely wine. I was absolutely staggered just over a year ago in my diploma class when we covered Argentina. We tasted a 100% Cabernet Franc. I thought, what's going on? I thought we were going to be drinking Malbec. It was from a producer called Bodega Eliana, and it was called the Gran Enemigo 2014. Just a quick note on the rather typically sparse tasting note that I'm famous for when it comes to my diploma studies. Well, I just wrote down black cherry, violets, dried herbs, black plum, red plum, vanilla, cedar, smoked chocolate coffee. That's from the oak, if you like, the oak aging sort of side of it, with a bit of tertiary development in bottle, getting a bit leathery, almost a bit meaty. Interesting. But I said in my notes, but above all, high levels of silky smooth tannins. And we're back to this thing about the tannins of Cabernet Franc. And I'm beginning to wonder again that I think that particularly the modern style, if you like, the New World style of Cabernet Franc is almost being, of course, terroir is massively important, but as is winemaking, clearly. And one thing I meant to say about Jerome, going back to our video, if you watch his winemaking video, he doesn't extract tannins, to use his words, he does an infusion of tannins because he really just wants the tannin to be so beautiful and lovely in the mouth. And I think you can do that with Cabernet Franc. So next slide, please. And the next two slides, a big shout out, thank you to Tim Atkin, MW, who let us use his photos. Tim, as you know, is a real South American expert. Brutini, this is a good producer, a sort of fairly high-end producer in Argentina. They've been going a long time, since the 20s, I think. And this lovely photo, you can obviously see the sense of terroir here, I think. Look at the altitude, look at those snow-capped peaks of the Andes in the background. We're in this, I can't pronounce this very well, Gualtari is a part of the Tupungato GI in the Uco Valley, north of Mendoza. So these are really exciting areas for Argentine winemaking. Altitude here, 1,200 meters, these vineyards, that's pretty high. But of course in Argentina, because you're at 33 degrees latitude, the sun is intense, there's not much rain, it's a very dry climate. I remember Jerome saying you need a bit of, Cabernet Franc needs a bit of moisture. You'll get that from irrigation from the Andes River, or maybe catching the rain when you get those heavy storms, and a bit of drip irrigation. Cabernet Franc mustn't be hydrically stressed, nor must I actually. Let's have a sip of water. Very good. So Routini, really interesting. Tim Atkin, these photos, he did a really great webinar last autumn about this. And it was really lovely to taste. Delicious, absolutely delicious wines. And the next slide, please. Here is the winemaker at Routini. Lovely Mariano. He's a really smiley chap, and he's revered in Argentina as one of the absolutely top winemakers. He doesn't just do Cabernet Franc, they have their Malbecs, they do single vineyard stuff, they do blends. At Routini, they're an important producer. Do look up Routini if you're interested in Argentina. Really good producer. And actually it's interesting because if you look at Jancis's Oxford Companion to Wine online, which is a few years old now, there's hardly any Cabernet Franc in Argentina in the early 2010s. It is increasing. I don't have the planting figures, but it's definitely increased the past 5 years or so. And I think Argentina, who are very good at marketing, look what they've done with their Malbec in the American market for their Malbec. I think they realize they can't just back the Malbec red wine horse all the time. And I think Cabernet Franc is really important for the evolution of Argentina on the global wine markets, for its red wines, obviously. Next slide, please, Lydia. Next sandwich next door to Argentina, of course, is Chile. And I just love Chile. I mustn't go on about Chile because I just find it so extraordinary, just the geography of Chile. You know, it's long and thin, it's next to the cold sea because of the current that comes up from the South Pole, and then you've got the Andes to the east, well, of course in Argentina they're to the west, because it's the Andes that separates the two countries. Blah, 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 blah. Shut up, Richard. Yeah, this is the second wine I'm going to be sipping. I'll sip them both later at the end to give Lydia time to gather together your thousands of questions that you want to ask me at the end. Yeah, again, not much Cabernet Franc really in Chile, but handily, you know, this wine is available in the UK via the Wine Society, and I wanted to sort of contrast, if you like, a sort of traditional Loire Valley expression with the New World, which is what we'll do. Just a quick word about Chile. This is from the Cabernet Franc here is from a producer called Tabali, and they are really super duper modernizing. They've got really funky wineries and stuff. They're almost in the Atacama. They're on the edge of the Atacama Desert. They're in the Coquimbo region. It's about as far north as you can do wine in Chile. The latitude is 30 degrees. Okay, when you consider in the Loire Valley, you're 47 degrees. So you're getting towards the extremes of, if you like, that magic 30 degrees to 50 degrees wine growing latitude of the world. But the weird thing is, in the valley there, it's the Limari Valley. So Tabali is the producer, and the region is the Limari Valley. You can see it on the map. Even though it's so far north for the southern hemisphere and at 30 degrees, it's actually quite cool. It's weird. I haven't been there to this part of Chile. I've been further south in Chile, but not there. Apparently, it's a cool desert, and that sounds weird, doesn't it? A cool desert. But the reason it's a cool desert, the sun's very intense. But particularly where the vineyards are for this wine, it's called, yes, it's called the Tabali vineyard where they make this Cabernet Franc, and it's a 2017 with tasting tonight. It's called Vetas Blancas. It's like a white limestone. Here we go, limestone again. Remember, Jerome talked about tuffeau, which is that very soft limestone you get in the Loire. Limestone is really rare in Chile. You hardly get any limestone at all. But here in Limari, you do. It's washed down from the Andes. And it's important, as you already know from Jerome, because it can retain some moisture. And boy, you don't get much rain here in Limari Valley, maybe 80 millimeters a year or something absurd. So you have to irrigate from the Limari River. But that's becoming an issue because the Andes snowmelt's decreasing because of the climate change, etc. But anyway, but why is it a cool desert? Because of that cool wind. This Vetas Blancas vineyard of Tabali is only 25 kilometers from the Pacific. And Lydia was telling me earlier how when she was in Chile doing her MW trip, some of her colleagues foolishly decided they were going for a swim in the Pacific Ocean. It's something you just generally don't do unless you're completely mad in Chile, because the sea is so cold because of that Humboldt current moving up from Antarctica. So believe it or not, you can be almost in the desert at 30 degrees latitude, which would be the equivalent of the Sahara Desert in Africa. But because of that cool sea and that current and the wind, your average daily summer temperature is 23 degrees centigrade. It's probably warmer in summer in London at 50 degrees than it is in Limari at 30 degrees. I must stop talking about geography. I just love it. And Chile is amazing. Okay, so hopefully some of you are tasting that wine, and we'll talk about it a little bit at the end. 6:45, so we're just going to finish up the next 5 minutes and then take some questions. I'm really excited that we're off to New York. Really love New York, and we can't wait to go back to New York. Just looking at the map, just at the very top, we've got the border with Lake Ontario. That's the border with Canada. Finger Lakes, talk about these in a sec. Hudson River Valley, which is kind of just due north of New York City. And then you've got Long Island sticking out, haven't you, a bit? Yeah. I mean, I know a little bit from the diploma study books for WSET that, you know, New York and Cabernet Franc are connected. It wasn't till I started researching this webinar, I realized what a big deal Cabernet Franc is in New York State. Yes, by the way, it's big. It can be, again, sorry, we're not in California and other places in the United States, but I wanted to focus on New York because they've basically, in the past few years, adopted Cabernet Franc almost as their kind of branding for their, you know, it's their go-to red wine. Because just bear in mind that Cabernet Franc is a European vine, okay, Vitis vinifera, and in the United States they have their own, if you like, we call them hybrids, but American vines that are different to the European vines. That's not to say, of course, they don't have European vines, because of course, immigration and all the stuff you see in California, Oregon, Washington State, elsewhere, they're all the grape varieties that we know and love, Pinot and Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, all the rest of it, European grapes. But over on the East Coast, they love Cabernet Franc. And again, climate has something to do with it, because I'm sure many of you will know, New York has a funny old climate. It can be so cold, particularly, I haven't been upstate, but up in the Finger Lakes, where you're getting up towards the Canadian border. the winters are brutal. Clearly, the vine's going to be in dormancy then, all being well. So, you know, you're not going to have any freezing buds and things like that. But it does mean the growing season is quite short. So therefore, you need a variety that can bud early and ripen fairly early in case the autumn suddenly comes quite quickly. And because we've already mentioned Cabernet Franc ripens earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon, it's quite winter weather hardy, so it can cope with cool weather. Cabernet Franc, it's kind of ideal for New York. Obviously, it gets a bit more extreme as you sort of go further north. The Finger Lakes, of course, I mean, there wouldn't be any wine any wine producer, any vines grown there if it weren't for those Finger Lakes, because it's the ambient temperature of those lakes that give you a little bit of kind of temperance against the brutal cold. So that's a similar story in Canada with Lake Ontario as well. And therefore the Hudson Valley, which is just up from New York City. In fact, let's look at Hudson Valley now. Next slide, please, Lydia. This kind of underlines my point. The Hudson Valley Cabernet Franc Coalition, that's been going since 2016. So there aren't many producers, probably 20 or 30 producers in the Hudson Valley. They are taking their Cabernet Franc so seriously that they've got this coalition together. They want to share expertise. They want to welcome wine tourism when, of course, we can get moving again, that sort of thing. And yeah, it's becoming a big deal. And ditto in Long Island, which is close to New York City again. Again, it's very slightly different climate there because, okay, the Hudson Valley, you're a little bit warmer than up in Finger Lakes, but again, you get really nasty storms in the Hudson Valley. Whereas at Long Island, which is a suburb of New York City, sticking out there into the Atlantic, and with the heat and the humidity, which I'm sure many of you have experienced if you've been to New York in the summer, New York City in the summer, the humidity is intense, and humidity is a pain. If you're growing vines, can be terrible for increasing the risk of fungal diseases and things like that. But hey, they manage it pretty well in Long Island, and Cabernet Franc again is their kind of star. Just to mention before we move on, and you'll see his link at the end. There's a really brilliant wine writer in the New York Times called Eric Asimov, and you'll see the link at the end. And he wrote an article last year called "He's in a Cab Franc State of Mind," and I just think that's great. There are loads of podcasts with the New York Vine and Grape Foundation, which are worth checking out as well. Wine Enthusiast podcast, that's the one to look up. Wine Enthusiast podcast. Sorry, it's not in my resources at the end. Episode 58 from August 2019 is all about Cabernet Franc in New York. It's really interesting. And finally, let's have a little look at Cabernet Franc in yet another different guise. Wow, that looks cold, doesn't it? There's cold, as they say in Wales. There's chilly. Yeah, ice wine. I would love to say I've tasted Canadian ice wine made from Cabernet Franc, but I have not. But many thanks to the marketing people at the Ontario Wines marketing people there for sending this rather lovely photo. Perhaps someone or a few of you listening tonight, maybe we've got some people from Canada. Tell us what it's like. Clearly, you know, for making ice wine, I won't give you a lecture on ice wine other than to say, surprise, surprise, it's got to be cold. -8 degrees C before those grapes can be picked. What a nice job that would be, hand picking grapes when they're -8 degrees. No thanks, I think I'll stay indoors. The yields will be incredibly low because you get a lot of rotting as well for grapes that haven't frozen properly. But it's the whole freezing business, of course, because the water becomes ice. And by the time you've crushed the grapes, you know, so much is in the ice that you've effectively removed water from the grapes, and that concentrates their flavors. And then, of course, you'll do your vinification off the skins because you'll be wanting to get those lovely fruity, you know, red fruit, particularly those plums, cherries, aromas, as well as lovely herbal aromatics will go into your ice wine. We'll try and have one day. We'll get WSET to put it on the syllabus. But if you are from Canada or you've tasted one, just drop a note in the chat. I'd like to hear about that. Right, well, we're coming to the end, and amazingly, I haven't overrun. I just want to maybe just have a little taste of the two wines that we've kind of promoted a bit this evening, that some of you will have seen. I realize not everyone has access to these wines, but I'm hoping some of you may have got them. And we've got the, on my first one I'm just sniffing, is, and I know which one it is because I'm smelling raspberry leaf, sorry to sound like an old record, violets, and this lead pencil thing again, and it's gorgeous. It has to be Loire Valley. This is Jerome Dillard's Domaine de la Noblesse, Le Temps des Cerises, 2019, and oh, it smells absolutely heavenly. It honestly, although it's not the same grape variety, if you ever do the aromatics on and you're lucky enough to have a really good Pinot Noir from, you know, Côte d'Or somewhere, the aromatics get you, you know, before you've even tasted the wine. You're having a symphony of smell before you've even tasted, and that's what Jerome, the genius Jerome, is doing with his wine. Absolutely glorious. And the other wine is the Taberly 2017. The Taberly, again, because of that intense sun, even though it's quite cool there in Limerick, has got a lot more ripening going on. It's 14.5%, the Chilean alcohol, whereas Jerome's Chinon is 13%, 13%, and that's in a warm year. So if that was a cool year, he probably could have been 12, 12 and a half. Anyway, let us know in the chat, but certainly on the nose, Jerome's Chinon is all the things I've said, and the Limari, the Taberly Chilean wine, is not as aromatic. It's earthier to me. It's lovely, but it's much kind of more grounded. It's got that sort of, yeah, it's got a little bit of farmyard. I'm not saying that in a nasty way or Brett or anything like that. I think it's got a little bit of something going on, but it hasn't got the really gentle, delicate aromatics that the Chinon has. And just on the taste, do taste with me if you can. Jerome Chinon. Oh, yum. Really lovely, medium bodied. Really lovely fruit. I mean, it's a warm 2019 in Loire, very warm. I had a couple of huge heat waves there. Very warm year. Quite fruit forward, I'd say. Certainly, that's you know, a slightly more modern Loire style, if I can put it that way. Certainly wasn't the ones that I was tasting after my first jackpot 15 years ago. All the others I said earlier, I thought were a bit thin and I didn't like them very much. This is not like that. But I do think Jerome is a genius winemaker, and he's got great terroir there. Absolutely lovely. Nice medium sort of plus acidity. It's got that backbone. It's got a decent finish. It's not very long finish. It's probably medium plus finish. And the tannins are there, but they're so beautifully done. They're very much part of the wine, but they're not aggressive at all. This is a young wine, for goodness sake. It's only 2019. I just think it's so beautifully balanced. I think that's terrific. Very good quality, I would say. And just a quick sip of the Taberly, fuller bodied. That's the alcohol giving it its fuller body. It's 14.5%, as I said. Yeah, it's kind of darker, broodier, sort of a bit more towards dark fruit, I'd say, than red fruit in the Chinon. Yeah, more black cherry, damson, quite tart actually, quite nice. You know, funny enough, the acidity almost to me tastes a bit more obvious than the Chinon, but maybe that's the really cool effect of that ocean breeze, really retaining that acidity. Much earthier, definitely. As I said, less aromatic than the Chinon, but a really lovely, Chilean New World take on Cabernet Franc. So just to wrap up, a couple of things before questions. Questions, I'm thinking, does Cabernet Franc sit in the shadow of its children, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, etc.? I don't think so. It's a bit enigmatic. It seems to be everywhere, but kind of nowhere unless you're in the Loire Valley. Is the Loire Valley really its spiritual home? And that's a slightly controversial thing to say because, of course, it's been planted most there for centuries. I just wonder whether the Loire is becoming its spiritual home because of the warmer climates and just making a more generous Cabernet Franc. I wonder whether that will open up Cabernet Franc to more people. Hungary's iconic red wine? Question mark. Well, let's see what happens with the marketing success or not of Vilaine Franc. And we know it's definitely New York's flagship red variety. And it's tough, although it can be delicate and aromatic, it's also tough because of the climates it can grow in. And it can be beautifully elegant when done well. And I think it's those soft tannins and the fact that maybe that the pendulum is swinging back a little bit now from those really big kind of Robert Parker, huge point scoring, chunky wines of the 1990s. I think people are more interested in terroir and delicacy. And I think Cabernet Franc has got a great future. Just want to say thanks to a few people. I've had lots of help with this. Mike Pearl for images, Andy Freeman for his amazing work with video, helping with that rather grainy video I threw him at the weekend. Our Hungary experts, Sue Tolson, Julia Scavo, and Peter Larson, and especially Lydia for holding the fort and doing all the bits and pieces. Thank you so much. But most importantly, to all of you for joining me on this Cabernet Franc discovery. It's 18:59. How did I do for time?
Spot on, Richard, and thank you so much. This fascinating session. Just to let everyone know, I have popped those links that are on the slide showing at the moment into the chat. So if it's easier, you want to copy any of those articles, I have popped those in the chat for you. And now, Richard, if you're ready, I'm going to fire a few questions your way.
Fire away.
So first one from Tim Island. You mentioned you wouldn't be going to Australia, South Africa, etc. on your world tour, but is Cabernet Franc grown widely or focused in these countries?
It's not a focus, a fair question, but if it really was a focus in these countries, I would have mentioned it tonight. So what I mean is it's a bit of an outlier. You get examples everywhere of producers in all those countries who love Cabernet Franc and are growing it. There's a producer in New Zealand called Waimea in Nelson. They're blending Cabernet Franc with Syrah. Wow. I've been trying to get hold of it. It's been listed with Majestic recently, but I can't get hold of it. Otherwise, I might have given that a mention. And there are loads of other examples. At McLaren Vale in Australia, I know there are some producers there who love Cabernet Franc. You know, the terroir is great in McLaren Vale for Cabernet Franc. So I'm not excluding these countries, but I just wanted really to give a focus tonight to the countries where, you know, it is planted significantly and where there are movements to really give Cabernet Franc a name.
Absolutely, it's always hard to cover every place in an hour, but you did get through a lot of the key areas. Another question for you is, which Cabernet Franc region do you think is the most prestigious?
Well, I suppose if you it depends how you sort of define prestigious. If prestigious means sorry, have another sip. Prestigious means noble and heritage and, you know, amazing aromatics and flavors, then I'd have to say a top producer, you know, like Jerome, actually from Chinon. I think Chinon, the delicacy and the aromatics are unbelievable. But if you're talking prestigious in terms of premium or super premium in price, then clearly your first stop would be Chateau Cheval Blanc, where I doubt you can get a bottle for under £100. And of course, Argentina, with their focus on Cabernet Franc, and the fact that, well, like the one we taste in Diploma at WSET, I think it's £60 a bottle or something. So yeah, so premium, definitely Argentina, definitely Cheval Blanc as an extreme, and the Super Tuscans as well, who are doing it. But hey, I want to taste Vilaine Franc. That is a premium and super premium movement in Hungary. I just haven't tasted it yet. So there's premium and prestigious dotted around, I'd say.
Excellent. And while you were just mentioning Hungary and sort of Europe, Tanya has asked, have you tasted varietal Cabernet Franc from Bulgaria?
I have not, and would love to. And I'm sure there's some grown in Romania too, which I know from diploma work covers most of the grape varieties and lots of international and Bordeaux varieties. So let us know what it's like, and can we get hold? If the question is always, can we get hold of it?
Yes, Tanya, if you could please send Richard a bottle.
Yes, that would be great, or a crate, or whatever you fancy. That would be good. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'm going back to Chinon, which you're obviously very passionate about, and I really want to try the wine now. Mark's asked, as it warms up, is it a concern that the wines there that won't age as well? So with sort of hotter vintages and global warming.
It's a good question, but I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because what you might find, and Jerome talks about this on the winemaking video, so do watch that. When you're going to have, what warmer years are bringing, of course, is riper fruit concentration. So if the winemaker is brilliant and you're still probably going to have a good backbone of acidity, even in a warm year, in a place like Chinon, then you could actually argue it the other way, because you're still going to have, in tasting note terms for WSET, SAT, probably medium plus, maybe even high, let's say medium plus acidity. You're going to have ripe fruit concentration. That's going to give you, the winemaker, the option to use maybe a bit more oak, which Jerome talks about in the winemaking video. Because, of course, what you don't want to do with a delicate thing like Cabernet Franc is to drown it with new oak flavors. But if you had really concentrated fruit, you could maybe up your new oak possibly a little bit. Jerome uses 10 to 15% new oak, for example. Lots of old oak and large oak to soften the tannins. But most good winemakers, Cabernet Franc will go 10 years, I would say. But of course, they'll keep their eye on global warming. Maybe they'll do what they're doing elsewhere. Maybe they'll just have to pick a bit earlier. Maybe they're going to have to compromise a little bit on the ripeness because they'll be worried about preserving the acidity. But I think in the hands of the right viticulturalists and winemakers, I just think the quality is going through the roof at the moment. It really, really is.
Brilliant. And then final question for you then. So obviously I think everyone's always keen to talk about all the areas that grow Cabernet Franc, or perhaps their favorite. But another area that was mentioned in the chat was Virginia in the States as well. Hey,
Virginia, great.
And Laura is asking, it's in recent decades, it's emerged as an excellent producer of Cabernet Franc. Do you have any particular insights or experience with Virginian Cabernet Franc?
I can answer that question really quickly. I'm afraid, I'm sorry to say the answer is no, but again, if maybe when I'm next in the States, I could try and hunt it down, or if we can find it in the UK, and if the person asking knows, or we can find out whether we can get hold of it in the UK. It's so hard to get American wine in the UK, actually. I mean, obviously not California wine so much, but these other states, I think virtually every state in the United States makes wine, but goodness me, we don't talk about those other states much. So I'd love to know more about it. So by all means, do contact me and send me details. I'd love to know more, because like anything, I think this Cabernet Franc webinar tonight for me has actually been, this is the end of the beginning. I feel as though I'm going to spend the rest of my life discovering Cabernet Franc.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for all your time, for your really enigmatic presentation. I know you put lots of hard work into researching it and buying the wines and enjoying them as well. So
that's the fun bit. Yeah, it's been great fun. It's been great fun, and yeah, I've got some unusual Cabernet Francs in my wine rack actually, including one from New York. I'm happy to report. So I'm looking forward to trying that. So no, it's a pleasure. Just thank you all very much for listening, and let's all celebrate Cabernet Franc, because it's a little bit, obviously a bit under the radar, but hopefully we're going to get to know it a bit better.
Brilliant. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you everyone
and
so
for the
much.
questions we managed to get through, and have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.